On that last matter that I was just summarizing in terms of that classified material, let me just ask any of you listening to that, is that how you all understand it in terms of the way this came up over the course of today?
Yes, indeed. I think you described it exactly right. There is something that Jennifer Williams submitted to supplement the record. It's classified, so we don't get to see it. But the Chief Justice, the presiding officer of the impeachment trial, put it into the record for the senators, and Mr. Schiff urged them to go look at it.
In terms of this document potentially being improperly classified, which is something that has been raised in writing by Adam Schiff and raised on the floor of the Senate tonight by Zoe Lofgren. Obviously, it's the vice president's office that said it was classified. They are being publicly criticized for that. If it has been improperly classified, and it should be something that the public can see, who adjudicates that?
Well, it's complicated. Ultimately, a court does, if it gets to that. And I do think we may be headed for a train wreck on classification, particularly if we get to the point where they subpoena documents and witnesses, because they're going to try, or Bolton's testimony, they're now making plans to try to say that everything he's going to testify to is classified. And you can't classify things just to keep them out of the public eye. There has to be a rational basis for the classification. And ultimately, it would be a matter for the judges.
And we already know we know for a fact they've used redactions in precisely this manner, right? I mean, we have FOIA lawsuits that have resulted in the production of documents even up till, as Adam Schiff noted, last night. And then in the last tranche of FOIA documents we got, someone got access to the unredacted copies of the emails. And lo and behold, there was no reason to redact the parts that were redacted, save to cover up things that look terrible and incriminating for the Trump administration. We also know that they blew through a deadline to produce the 302, the interview with Jared Kushner, which is now going to be taken up in court. There's a filing about that.
Justice Department admitting they want to further review it.
Right? So there's already, I think it's already very hard to credit good faith with these assertions, given the pattern that has already been established in the way they've gone about all.
And keep in mind, Rachel, that senators, if they go to a classified briefing or they look at a classified document and they are confident that it should not be classified, they can speak out and tell people about it.
They can't tell people about the content.
Oh, no.
The classified content.
In fact, I think Senator Murphy, or one of the senators on the air in the last few days, was talking about, I asked him the question, what if they try to phony classify Bolton's testimony? He goes, I will make the decision to speak about it publicly. So then
defying
exactly, because then it flips. Then the people who've classified it have to show that they wrongly disclosed classified information, and the predicate for that would be to prove that it should have been classified in the first place.
So you're saying that if what Zoe Lofgren and Adam Schiff are implying and suggesting about this classified Jennifer Williams document is true, if it's an improper classification, one of the 100 senators who was just given access to it tonight, just moments ago by John Roberts' order, one of them might say, this can't be classified. I will risk this.
I'm going to risk it and go for it.
on TV and tell you what's in this document.
Their staff will probably go crazy and go, don't you dare. This is way too risky. But I'm willing to bet with the stakes involved here that if there's something important in that document and it's not legitimately classified, somebody will, in fact, speak about it.
Can we just make one, just on the flip side of this, is Donald Trump constantly declassifies classified of actual national security information. Remember that he did it with the Carter Page in terms of his FISA warrants. He also shared national security secrets with Vladimir Putin. So when it's in his interest, he absolutely shares national security. The only thing we're seeing in the cover-up are the things that he feels are not helpful to him.
Chuck, what's your reaction to what Senator McCaskill is suggesting in terms of how much of a high wire would a senator be on if he or she chose to do what she's describing?
I think it's quite risky. I mean, the classification system is designed for and the power of it is held by the president. The president delegates that throughout the executive branch so other officials can classify and declassify information. But that whole structure is set up for a president, not this president, a president. And so here's the danger. A senator might look at it in good faith, think, this shouldn't be classified. There's nothing about this thing that's important or secret or dangerous if disclosed. and not understand how that information was collected. And so it could be bad faith, but it could be a perfectly good reason to keep it classified. And that's why I think courts are reluctant to get involved in that dispute. And that's why we often delegate that sort of decision making to the executive.
And one of the things that we're seeing, I mean, this is a microcosm of the issue writ large, right, which is a kind of constitutional crisis, which is a variety of powers asserted by the executive that are checked by essentially good faith and lawyering within the executive, right, and an expectation of pursuing good faith, whether in pursuance of an ideological agenda you do or do not like, right? What we are seeing and what we've seen from lawyering in the administration in the courts, and it has been resulted in these excoriating decisions from judges appointed by different parties, right, is this bad faith, the constant bad faith in legal documents and in legal filings over and over and again, essentially just lying to courts about the reason they are doing something. And in all of these things, whether it's classification or assertions of executive privilege, right, these tend not to be refereed by the courts. They tend not to get to that point precisely because they are worked out between the branches or there's some assumption of good faith on the lawyers.
I think that's exactly right, Chris. First of all, typically there's an accommodations process, right? When the executive wants to keep something from, let's say, the Senate or the Congress. Those two branches of government get together and figure out a way to get some amount of that information in some fashion to people who want it. But there's another problem. Courts are loath to interject into these political questions. In fact, there's something called the political question doctrine. Courts have typically said, when it comes to this type of decision, we are not really equipped to second-guess the executive on questions involving national security. And so I think Claire's right. The senator could disclose it, but there is quite a risk there, and I wouldn't advise it.
But ultimately, if they do it, then it does go to the court, because the only risk to them is that they are charged with disclosing information, and then it goes in front of a judge, and a judge looks at it and goes, well, there's nothing here classified. This is just Donald Trump trying to hide stuff.
If somebody is charged, sure, but I mean, that's several steps down the road.
That's the real risk they'd be facing.
That's the real risk they'd be taking.
That's the risk they would be facing.
Well, the other part, I mean, any senator facing this sort of risk-reward calculation would also have to think about what the public benefit is of disclosing this information.
Has to be good.
How much is in that Jennifer Williams one-page document about what Pence did with Ukraine? We don't know. Now, and if it is about the way they're going to try to keep John Bolton's testimony from the public ever hearing about it, that might be something, depending on what he says, that would lead somebody calculating that risk versus reward to land in a different way.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.